Hey guys, welcome to the channel. Let's go and take a look at the best books I've rated. So I've been thinking about this one for a little while and I thought it was time to revisit one of the videos I did last year looking at the best series I've rated. So this is different to my favourite series, which is just based on a kind of gut feeling, what I thought about them, how much of an impact the books and the series have had on me. This one is all about the mechanics of it, the individual ratings that I score the books in the series. So for those who've watched any of my reviews, you'll probably be used to my weighted ratings. For those who haven't though, I rate books using a system which is a bit similar to Corepile. It looks at various different aspects of a book and I assign a score. But with weighted ratings, I give a higher score, or I have more points available for certain elements that mean the most to me in terms of looking at how good a book is. So for just over 10 years now, excluding a couple of years where I had a reading slump, I've rated every single book using this system. The only thing that I don't rate in there are novellas, because it would be a bit unfair, it would be a bit unbalanced to include those and to score them using the same mechanism. But to quickly run through it, the four main aspects that I rate, and I score these out of 20, are overall enjoyment, world building, characters and plot. And these are the four elements that for me have the highest bearing, the highest weighting on how good a book is. The other aspects I rate are the writing style, which is out of an available 10 points, the pacing, of which I give marks up to 5, and then I've also got a discretionary section which is also out of 5, and that gives me a total of 100 possible points. The discretionary is literally as it sounds, it is extra points that I add on at my discretion, and this will usually be for things like good cover art, maps inside, internal artwork and so forth, but also just every so often I want to add an additional point or two to a book. This will usually be because the book has special meaning to me, so maybe it's the final book in the series that I've really been enjoying, or something along those lines. So I've got plenty of new entries on this list. There were 19 originally when I first did this one, and like with that first video, I'm only including series where I've scored at least 2 of the books using my weighted ratings. So to get the ball rolling, we'll start at the bottom with number 20 on the list, and this is the First Law trilogy by Joe Abercrombie. This is the original trilogy, so The Blade Itself, Before They Are Hanged and Last Argument of Kings. I really enjoyed this one, but overall in my weighted ratings it came out with an average of 73%. For the individual books in there we had a 67, 73 and 79, so it does show a good progression with each book in the series getting better as far as my ratings go. And I will often find that with a series that's set in one world, because of course you do get a progression of the world building and the characters and so forth. I say this quite a lot in my reviews and it definitely shows out in some of these ratings. Now I haven't written down all of the scores that I gave these books in the individual categories, so I'm not going to be able to pick out necessarily what it was that scored a book particularly high or particularly low, or in comparison to another book what the differences were. But overall this was a good series that I did have a good time with, but I think there were, especially at the start, just a few aspects that I didn't like, but we saw more of those aspects that I did like as we progressed through the series. The one that really sticks out to me is the Northmen, who I had a really good time with, so spending more time with Dogman and his crew really elevated these books in my opinion and led to a higher enjoyment score. In 19th place with an average rating of 74, so 1% higher than the First Law trilogy, we've got the Lacanius trilogy by James Islington. Now this one, if I was using my gut feeling, I would rate lower than the First Law series, but that's the beauty of these. It takes all the emotion out of it and just looks at what I rated the individual elements of each book in the series. So the 3 titles in this trilogy scored in a pattern which is the opposite to what I normally find and the opposite to what I did find with First Law. We started out with 77, then went down to 73 and then 72% for the 3rd book in the trilogy. I really had high hopes for this trilogy. The first book I had a really good time with, I enjoyed it quite a bit. But then, as you can see from the scores, it did go downhill. So even though you had additional world building and character development, it was mostly the plot that took a turn that I didn't really like. I didn't get along with it, and by the end of it I was practically forcing myself through that last book to be able to put it down and finish the series. In 18th place, we've got a series which I've given an average rating of 76.33. This is from 3 books out of quite a few more that are in the series. I read the Draenei Saga by David Gemmell. I've read lots of the books in this series over the years, but there's only 3 that I've actually read whilst I've been using this weighted ratings and therefore scored, because I don't score retroactively. I will add these scores right after I finish reading a book, so it's too difficult to go back to a book that I read months or years ago and try to fill in the rating, so I won't do that with any of them. From this series though, I read Legend, Hero in the Shadows and Winter Warriors. So Legend was a reread because I read it many years ago, and I've read it again about 10 years ago now, really early on in the time that I was using this weighted ratings. So the scores that I had for the books overall, if I just find on the list, were 73, 81 and 75. 81 was Winter Warriors, if I remember rightly. I really had a good time with it. It was a real good adventure and I absolutely loved my time spent in that world in general, but also in particular for that one book. So I've not been including the previous positions just because it slipped my mind, but with those 3 series that I've listed so far, in my previous video, the First Law was in 13th, it was 12th for the Lacanius, and it was 10th for the Draenei. I can't remember if I'd read all 3 of the Lacanius books at that point, but I think for the other 2 I've not read any additional books in the series. But we do have a new entry in at number 17, which is The Song of Kamaria by T.A. Bruno. So far I've read 2 of the books in this series and it comes out with an average score of 76.5. From those 2 books, because I rated the first book 79% and then the second one 74%. So again, I didn't have quite as good a time with the second book as I did with the third, but I'm but I'm hoping with the third that I will get back into it and I'll enjoy it and it'll get a nice high score. This is a sci-fi. I think it is, if I just skim through here. It's the only sci-fi that I've actually got on the list, largely because I've not been reading many sci-fi series, and of the ones that I did, it was during that fantasy reading slump where I wasn't scoring on my spreadsheet, so I've not included them here for reasons I've already discussed. This one though, a nice new entry. It's come in at 17th on the table and it's holding its own amongst some of the fantasy greats that I've got on this list. At 16th with an average score of 77% is the Karaidec Sagas by Alicia Wanstall-Burke. So this is one of the completed series on this list where I've read and scored all of the books in that series. The books in here did have that normal progression that I tend to see, going from 70% for book 1, 77 for book 2, and then 84 for book 3, which I really had a good time with, and I thought really wrapped up the world in a great way, or the series in a great way. It was really good progression with each book, unveiling more of the world and giving you more character development, and that's just the embodiment of what I love about a series. So it was great work on this one. The previous position on that one was 9th, so it has dropped down a few places. So I just got interrupted by the doorbell, which luckily for me was some book mail for a title that's going to be included later on in this list. I think I was saying there though that the fall down the ratings for the Karaidec Sagas, going from 9th to 16th in this list, is a good thing for me, because it means that I've been reading some really good books in series that have displaced it. In 15th and previously at 11th in this list is the Tide Child Trilogy by R.J. Barker, which for some reason is a tongue twister for me. Tide Child Trilogy. This one consists of 3 books, all of which are included in here. I gave 74, 77 and then 83 for an average rating of 78% for this series. So again, a good one where I've given a higher score as the books go along. I really enjoyed the last book of the series. It took what was a very strange world that I was having a good time with, but wasn't going to be one of my favourite series by any stretch, and it just wrapped up the story quite nicely. I love how the final kind of acts of the book just go full circle to the start of the first book. So if you haven't read it, it's a definite recommendation if you want something a little bit different with a really inventive world, and it's also set at sea. So I know a lot of people like a seafaring fantasy and struggle to find them. If you haven't already read this one, there's an option there for you. Next up in 14th, it's a new entry. This is The Ashes of Averin by Thiago Abdallah. So the 2 books in this series have scored 75 and then 82. I did have a good time with these, but I had a few little niggles with book 1, and they were pretty much resolved with book 2, because we had all of the world building out of the way, or not all of the world building, but the initial world building out of the way, and that's where some of the problems for me came in. So with those cleared, book 2 was able to just build on what we already knew, and I love that aspect of it. The average score that this one came out with is 78.5, and that's a really good score overall, but especially with that second book score, it's a really good indication, I hope, of where the series is going. Another new entry in 13th is because I read the second book of The Reborn Empire by Devin Madsen. So at the time I filmed this video originally, the first book was already on my list, but I didn't have any additional books in the series. Now I do, and it's come out with an average score of 79%, so I had a really good time so far with this series. So book 1 in The Reborn Empire scored 76%, and then book 2 was 82, so just 1% higher for book 1 than the first book of The Ashes of Averin. This is one that I'm looking to continue with this year and read hopefully both of the remaining books, although one of them doesn't come out until mid-year, so there are 2 remaining here, so who knows whether it'll be higher or lower in this table the next time I revisit it. And then the last of 3 new entries in a row here is the Onyxborn Chronicles by D.W. Ross, in at 12th place with a score of 79.67. So again, this is one which really built with each particular book in the series. The 3 books in the Onyxborn Chronicle scored 79, 79 and 81, so really consistent actually, especially with those first 2 books. So again, this is one that I think had a really good ending, everything pulled together quite nicely and gave a really intense climax to the book and of course to the overall series. So I'm looking forward to seeing what D.W. Ross does next, because I did have a good time with this debut series of his. In 11th place, we've got the first 4-book series in this list, or first series that I've read and scored 4 books for these ratings. This is The Shadows of the Apt by Adrian Tchaikovsky, in at 11 but down from 7 in my previous list. So the 4 books that I've read in here were the final 3 books in the series, The Air War, The War Master's Gate and Seal of the Worm, and also a reread that I did last year, I think it was, of the first book in the series, Empire in Black and Gold. So these scored, and I can't remember which way round I've put them, if I've put them as 1, 8, 9, 10, or if I've done 8, 9, 10 and then 1 as the order I read them. But these scored 80% for the first book that I've listed, 72, 80 and then 90. So I think the 90 was Seal of the Worm, so the 80 at the start was probably Empire in Black and Gold. If you've watched this channel for long enough, you know that Shadows of the Apt is one of my favourite series. It rated, I think, 2nd in my list when I did my overall favourite series of all time, so we'll see where that's going to be when I revisit that list later on in this year. But really good series, such creative world building that I really loved, and so many characters that I fell in love with in this series, so it's definitely a high recommendation. Into the top 10 now, and down from 6th we've got Bloodsworn by John Gwynne. This one, I've read both of the books that are available so far and given an average rating between the 2 of them of 81.5%. So that was 79 for The Shadow of the Gods, and then the second book, The Hunger of the Gods, scored 84. This one again has got some real creative world building that I absolutely loved, and I'm really excited for the final book in this series, which I anticipate being an absolute banger and getting a really good score, because I know John Gwynne's writing, I trust what he does, and I'm really looking forward to it. A new entry then at 9 is a duology where I read both books in the last 12 months or so, and that is Quest for Heroes by Stephen Aryan. So we've got The Coward and The Warrior just over my shoulder here. These books I really enjoyed. The first book, The Coward, I just really thought was a breath of fresh air. The Warrior wasn't as good for me, so I think although I've not looked at the ratings on my sheet yet, The Coward did score higher. Let's find out. So they were very close. Came out as 82% overall, and it was 83 for The Coward and 81 for The Warrior. So definitely a good series. You can see from the books on the shelf behind me that they are nice, chunky, but not nearly too chunky books. They're about 400 pages ish, so not too bad in terms of getting into and finishing a full series. At number 8, and down from 5th in the previous list, we've got The Greatcoats by Sebastian de Castell, and as far as the ratings for these 4 books go, they're a bit up and down. So in order from book 1 to 4, I scored 81, 82, 86 and then 80. So the lowest rated book, oddly enough, was the 4th book in the series. Not sure why that was, because I definitely have fond memories of all of them, but I do remember that I really enjoyed book 3, and maybe it was just a bit of a come down from that, going straight into book 4, because I read 2, 3 and 4 back to back. Overall, this is a great series. I love the banter in it. The world is kind of a generic world. You've got the geography side of it, but you've not got a vast amount that's needed to be done in the world building because it's all about the characters and the story they go on. There are lots of things that really do highlight good world building though. It's not the most important part of this series. Again, as are all of the books in this list, it's a definite recommendation if you want a completed series that's going to give you a real good adventure. A series that's gone up in the rankings now. We're at 7th and it was previously at 8th. This is Threadlight by Zach Argyle. So I've now read the 3rd book in the series and completed the trilogy, and the scores here average out at 82.67 with 77, 81 and then a final 90% score for the 3rd book in the series. So I love the magic in here. The characters were really good, the world building was really good, but it was the magic that really drew me to this series the most. It's got a really good plot actually going through the 3 books, but especially Voice of War, that 1st book in the series, had some elements that I really enjoyed. I was pleased to see that they carried on through the 2nd and 3rd book, even if they weren't quite as prevalent. But overall, it's a great series. It was a real roller coaster of emotion for that 3rd book, and I absolutely loved it. So again, this is a nice, pretty short series. They're only about 350 or so pages per book, and it's now a completed trilogy. So if you haven't read it, get out there and try it out. Then I've got what is actually the only tie, if I'm not mistaken, on this list, or at least in the top 20 portion of the list that I'm doing today. At equal 5th in the list, I've got a new entry, first of all, which is the Illborn Saga by Daniel T. Jackson, and also the last book that I actually read and therefore put onto my weighted ratings was the 2nd book in this series, Age of All Sin. So the 1st book I really enjoyed. It came out at 79%, but book 2 came out at 90, so that's a really big improvement, given an average score of 84.5 for the 2 of them. I really can't recommend this series enough. The 1st book, as I say, was a really solid start. I gave it a 5-star rating, even though it only scored 79%. It did need some work in the world building and some tidying up in various other elements of it, but you do tend to get that in the 1st book in a series, and especially for a debut author. What it was lacking, if anything, in the 1st book was given in spades in the 2nd book, and everything that it had in book 1 was really built upon as well. So I absolutely loved that 2nd book, and it's already going to be one of my favourites of the year, even though I've only just finished it in the middle of January. And then sitting level with it on 84.5 in equal 5th place, I cannot seem to split these 2 series. This is The Bound and the Broken by Ryan Cahill. Now, at the time of filming this, I am in the middle of reading book 3, so this weighted rating is only based on 2 of the books in the series, and it comes out with 80% and 89, so 1% higher for book 1 and 1% lower for book 2 compared to the Illborn Saga. So I don't know yet what the rating for book 3 is going to be, because as I say, I put in the ratings pretty much as soon as or shortly after finishing the book, but certainly within 24 hours. So I will know soon, but I don't know whether it'll be higher, lower, or whether it'll stay on that same average rating or thereabouts, because it was at a half mark. But I, again, absolutely love this series. I'm having a great time with it, and I'm really looking forward to continuing with it, especially because they are such big, beefy books, which is something that I love, and there's going to be plenty of them. Okay, so in 4th in my list is the highest new entry that I have here. This is The War Eternal by Rob J. Hayes. At the moment, I've read 3 of the books on this series, and they come out with an average score of 85%. So book 1 was the favourite of them and the highest scoring as well. It came out as 87, and then the other 2 books in the series that I've read so far both scored 84% in my weighted ratings. I really loved what we got in book 1, with such an isolated setting which almost became a character in itself. We spend most of the book in the deep dark pit, and it's a really atmospheric book as a result, but some great character work in there as well, especially with the audiobook, which I listened to and highly recommend. Okay, so moving into the top 3, and I'm not going to say too much about these, although I've been given a bit of a whistle-stop tour through the books anyway, because these 3 are the same top 3 I had in the previous video. I've not read any further books from the series because they are all complete, so these scores are not going to change, and it's down to the books that I've not read yet from different series or those already mentioned today to challenge these at the top of the table. So in third place with an average score of 89.67, we've got the 3 books that make up Rye-era Revelations. I'm listing them as a trilogy because that's how I have them, as the traditionally published bind-ups rather than the 6 individual books originally self-published. So these ones came out with 91, 87 and 91% for the 3 bind-ups. I just loved my time with these characters, Royce and Hadrian, as 2 of my favourites, probably my favourite double act all told, and I just loved the adventures that they got up to, as well as the snarkiness with which they took you along for the ride. And then still there at number 2 is Faithful and the Fallen by John Gwynne, my favourite series of all time, which comes out with an average rating of 90. The 4 books there scored 81, 91, 93 and 95%, so great progression through the series, although Malice, just as the debut book, was a little bit rougher around the edges, but once it found its stride, this series grabbed my heart and just hasn't let go since. So I absolutely love it, can't say enough good things about it in basically every single department, and it sits quite proudly right at the top of the table. The only thing that's above it in the list, in fact, is the follow-up series of Blood and Bone, also by John Gwynne, of course, which comes out with an average score of 92.67 from a 90, a 93, and a 95% rated book. So again, I obviously loved these books. The advantage in this particular list is that they didn't have all of the hard work that Malice did, and perhaps slightly suffered for in the enjoyment stakes, because it was already done in the Faithful and the Fallen series. So this one takes place a couple of 100 years after those opening 4 books, but the world is largely the same. There are some long-lived characters who continue into this series as well, so you've got that familiarity, and a lot of the characters and the events in that original series do come up in this follow-up series as well. So enjoying that first series and then going into this one, it was just like being welcomed home again. So that's my top 20 anyway, based on my ratings. This is very different to my top 10 favourite fantasy titles, which I will be revisiting later on this year, but I find it really interesting to see how breaking it down to the individual ratings of enjoyment, world building, characters, plot, writing style and pacing, what a difference each one of those individual aspects can make overall. If you enjoyed this video, do the usual stuff with liking it, drop me a comment down below to let me know what you thought about it, if there were any surprises on here, if there are any series that you think have a good chance of making a future instalment of one of these lists. That's it for today, thanks very much for spending your time with me. I hope to spend some more time with you in the next video sometime soon, but until then, as always, take care of yourselves, read some good books, bye for now.